The government and the foreign-backed opposition delegates share one thing in common, that the talks have reached a complete deadlock. The United States and Russia blamed each other for the failure. The opposition is only interested in forming a governing transitional body as the focus, while the official Syrian government delegation repeated their stance that terrorism should be the focus. In this edition of the debate, we'll discuss why 18 months after the Geneva I talks, with all the preparations and political maneuvering of the United States and Russia, Geneva II has been such an utter failure.
A dead end. That's the only outcome which both the Syrian government and the so-called Syrian National Coalition agree on after days of fresh talks in Geneva. The bone of contention in this round seems to be the same issue which broke down the first round of negotiations in late January: interpretations of the Geneva communique. The Syrian delegation insists that fighting terrorism should be the first priority in any talks. It says the opposition is refraining from admitting that there are terrorist and extremist groups on the ground in Syria. The government side also accuses the opposition of only sticking to one particular demand.
Unfortunately, the other side has come with a different, unrealistic agenda which only contains one item, and it selectively addresses the Geneva communique. The other party doesn't want to talk about anything else except the question of the transitional government.
For their part, the SNC has accused Damascus of being belligerent.
We came to these negotiations with a lot of doubts that we have a negotiating party, that the regime is serious about political solution. We put before the regime a proposal, and the regime would not even really acknowledge that proposal. And so that's, it's quite disappointing.
On the diplomatic front, Russia is blaming the U.S. for derating the talks. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said Washington is seeking regime change in Syria. He made the comments after U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said agreeing on a transitional government body is the sole purpose of the talks.
The Russian position since the beginning is very clear. It aims at achieving an agreement that is brokered between Syrians themselves, which is not really the situation of the Syrian National Coalition. That is really underlooking all the problems, political problem, the warfare issues, the humanitarian issues.
At the same time, more Syrians are fleeing the country. The battle between foreign-backed insurgents and government troops is now focused on areas near Lebanon's border. The Syrian military has captured the town of Jarajir and its hills in the strategic El Qalamoun area, and it's now focused on the town of Yabrut, the last insurgent stronghold in the mountainous region. It seems that finding any political solution for the nearly 3-year conflict is doomed, as long as the U.S. and its Western and regional allies seek regime change instead of a comprehensive and genuine political solution to the crisis in Syria.
Let's try to see if we can get some answers to the crisis in Syria. Let me introduce our guest. UN correspondent for Newsmax magazine, Stewart Stogel, joins us from New York. We have former American intelligence linguist Scott Rickard joining us from Orlando. Gentlemen, welcome. Scott Rickard, let me start with you. Actually, we had our art group design this wall, and I'd like to point the wall out to you. The pictures that we have over here. You have the spokesman for the so-called divided SNC with his finger up, and you also have Faisal McDodd from the Syrian delegation, pretty much showing how these talks went. According to the spokesman there of the SNC, deadlock was the word I believe that he used. Why do you think these talks have hit a deadlock?
It's obvious why these talks have hit deadlock. These talks from the get-go have been illegitimate. When you talk about the Syria National Coalition, this is a group that has been formed by the West, specifically by the West and its allied petro partners out of Saudi Arabia, out of Qatar, and also between the French, the UK, and the United States, alongside their Jordanian and Israeli partners in military crime in the region, and Turkey as well. These are organizations that have instigated war on Syria for over 3 years now. And beginning in 2011 and following the illegal war on Libya, this has been a massive shipment of arms into so-called rebels against the Syrian government. And these rebels have been hired from all over the planet. Anybody that's willing to come and fight based upon some religious means or some jihadi means, and also obviously mercenary means. So what you're seeing here is a coalition of bandits that are by no means representing the Syrian people. And it was obvious from the beginning that this would not be fruitful. And you can see that Assad has been very cooperative. He's given up all of his chemical weapons over this time, and he's still putting up with foreign insurgencies coming from these band of, I guess, bandits of nations that are continuing to attack Syria.
Well, Stewart Stogel, there are a number of points there made by Scott Rickard. You can take your pick. Which one would you like to have a reaction to?
Well, the last time I heard rhetoric like this, it came from Mohammed Saeed al-Sahaf when the Americans were invaded Iraq, and we also what happened to Baghdad Bob. These talks are not illegitimate. The fact of the matter is, I know Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, for more than 20 years. If he and Putin thought these talks were illegitimate, they would not participate. So let's get one thing straight. These talks are legitimate. Now, you may have two different sides with two different opposing visions that can't reconcile those differences, but to start off calling these talks illegitimate is basically a non-starter.
Why is it that then both are blaming each other? You're having the Russian and the American side blaming each other. And, well, Russia has come out and said that, you know, we thought that these talks did not have a time limit. They should go on with no timeline in terms of it taking place. And then right after the talks ended for the day, maybe a couple hours afterwards, you had the U.S. side coming out and saying that the Syrian delegation is stonewalling these talks at every turn, and it's the Russians at fault, and they should have pushed the Syrian side more.
Well, what you're seeing is a microcosm of what I would see a deterioration in U.S.-Russian relations. And the reason the Syrians are being so obstinate is because at this particular point, Lavrov believes he has the upper hand. And until the Americans realize that, you're not going to get anywhere. Now, why do the Russians have the upper hand? It's because you have a very weak foreign policy leadership in Washington. And John Kerry obviously has not gained the respect of Sergei Lavrov. And Lavrov believes he can push Kerry around. And to Lavrov's credit, that's exactly what's happening. Vladimir Putin is trying to reestablish the old Soviet presence in the Gulf, and he's doing it with a moderate degree of success.
Scott Rickard, I see you shaking your head.
That is complete ridiculousness. I mean, this gentleman is saying some really wild things about Russian regimes. You know, Russia has one base outside of their own country, and it happens to be in Syria. And this, you know, the Americans have well over 200 bases around the world and are present in over 900 deployments around the world. So this is very illegitimate, this conversation. This gentleman is saying more around the lines of, you know, Russia is the problem. The problem here is specifically the United States, and Russia gracefully went to these talks regardless of the fact of how illegitimate they were, and regardless of how the fact of how criminal the United States regime has been throughout this time. And so the reason that Russia is doing this, if you'd like to know, is because they're playing by the rules. They're playing by the rules and being an honorable nation, not a nation that's trying to subvert the United States.
This is ridiculous. First you call the meetings illegitimate, then you say the Russians are playing by the rules.
By being graceful to the international community. In fact, what they should have done is said, would you please bring some people who actually represent the Syrian people? This Syrian National Coalition does not represent the Syrian people. That's what that makes it illegitimate.
Well, how do you know,
and the fact that the Russians
represents the Syrian people? Who made you the expert?
I can tell you right now, do you remember when these particular protests started and how many people protested back in 2010? Do you know that it was a very small amount of the community, only tens of thousands of people out of a 20 million country? Do you know that when their first shots were fired down in Dara, they could have been fired from the Golan Heights or from Jordan? It was only 3 miles from the border. Do you know that the American president actually marched the next day with, the American ambassador to Syria marched the next day with protesters in Damascus. So this is the kind of regime that the United States has been supporting, a false protest and a false rising in the Syrian.
I have personally dealt one-on-one with senior members of the Syrian government, specifically Farouk al-Shara, for one. I've met, and I know for a long time, the Russian foreign minister, as well as the United States Secretary of State. Have you met any of these folks? You're making wild allegations about all of them. I've personally dealt with the three major participants.
And what is your outcome of that? Did you see any positive outcome for the United States? Did you see anybody in the United States that hasn't been attacking Syria since the 1970s? This has been going on for over 40 years from the United States, and it also has been going on for over half a century out of Israel.
Oh, yes, and the al-Assad family in Syria have been the upholders of human rights? What, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? This is a bastion of civil rights in Syria,
look at the human rights
one of the most repressive regimes in the Middle East.
Look what's happened in the United States. The Americans have killed over 50 million people in the last century. They've killed over 25 million people in the last half century. You have to take into consideration the kind of imperialist nation that you're trying to defend here.
Would put them in the same vein as Adolf Hitler. That's ridiculous.
Well, let's move on here. Stewart Stogel.
You should do your research and look at all the wars that have gone on over the last 100 years.
We could have
I've done my research, sir. I've also dealt with the participants. It's you who should be doing your research. I haven't heard this kind of babble since the Soviet Union collapsed.
Well, let's talk about the representation of the opposition, since you gentlemen touched on that. Stewart Stogel, there was a sign from the very beginning which was very odd, and that was the absence of the SNC president, Ahmad Jarba, who had appointed a negotiator to attend these talks. And he had promised Russia, along with the United States and the UN Secretary General and Lakhdar Brahimi, all of them promised that they were going to have a broader representation. What happened?
Well, obviously, you've got two sides at this point that are rather hard on their views. And I will agree with the host that there's going to have to be put pressure on both sides to see some movement. At this particular point, to be quite honest with you, the Russians see no vested interest in pushing their side to make any compromises. And the Americans are too weak at this point to put enough pressure on the Syrian opposition to be more amenable. So you've got two sides, one rather strong, one rather weak, and the result is stagnation.
Well, let's...
That's absolutely false.
Go ahead, Scott Rickard.
The fact is that Syria has made a lot of compromises. The Assad government has given up all of their chemical weapons. That is a huge compromise.
Let's take a quick time out. Hold your thoughts, Stewart Stogel.
To begin with.
I'm sorry. Hold your thoughts while we take a quick time out. Let's check out some of the viewer comments on our Facebook page, and we'll come back to you, Stewart Stogel, with a reaction. Let's check out the viewer comments.
The goal of the talks for the Americans is to install a lackey regime in Syria. The U.S., disgraceful Saudi Wahhabis and Israel want to install a puppet easy to control so they can take Syria's resources for the greater Israel plan, and then they will try and move into Iran and do the same. These three countries need to take their mercenaries out of Syria, and then there won't be any more fighting. The Syrian government is just doing what it's supposed to be doing, protecting and fighting for the country and its people. Okay, so the war on terror costs how much? $3 trillion? Now they are in favor of terrorism. This would infer complete incompetence and a total lack of morality and scruples. Time to stop the U.S. hard.
Some of the viewer comments there. Stewart Stogel, I promise I'm going to come to you first. Go ahead. You were talking before the break.
Again, like I say, to me, the bigger picture is U.S.-Russian relations. Until those relations are conducted on a more equal footing, which they aren't right now, you're not going to see any progress in peripheral issues like the Syrian situation. This is going to go on for a long time, and everybody at the UN knows this, including Ban Ki-moon.
The bigger picture is what I'd like to get to with you, Scott Rickard. What do you think? Some are saying the bigger picture is the role that Israel's playing on Syria, prolonging the war, maximizing the destruction. Why? Because if Syria becomes a failed state, then obviously this is going to spread in the Middle East regarding the sectarianism that has been promoted. And of course, the Middle East that's in a chaos means that that's good for Israel, because if the Middle East is not in that state, and it's in a healthy state, then Israel should be worried.
Well, that's exactly right. You know, you don't have to look very far. Just look at Yemen. Just look at Libya. Just look at what they've done in Iraq. You know, any time that you have a stable government that is basically prospering both financially and with growing in their economic and political infrastructure, the U.S. has gone after them, especially if they're outside the U.S. financial control. I mean, what happened in Libya was an incredible crime. What's happening in Syria is an incredible crime, and definitely the supposed only democracy in the Middle East. You know, these people who, you know, basically, if you're, you know, there was an article that came out today where prisoners Israeli prisoners are basically denying their wives the ability to have divorce because this is one of the democracy's rules, and the rabbis are basically referring to give them kosher food while they're in prison. You know, these are the kinds of individuals that have, you know, extremist views out of Israel that are causing what I would say extremely poor foreign policy coming out of the United States for over a century when it comes to the Middle Eastern agenda for the French, the American, and the British triangle of axis of evil, that it continues to control not only that region but many other regions around the world.
Stewart Stogel, I'm curious as to why you would say, unless you have a reaction to what Scott Rickard said, but I'm curious as to why you would say that there is a weak U.S. As displayed by, I guess, the mob administration perhaps, but in particular John Kerry, who perhaps in some ways, I think you mentioned that it's being maneuvered by Russia. Why would you say that? I mean, I was under the impression that it was the U.S. that was contemplating attacking or being military involved in Syria just a short while ago.
Well, yeah, we've heard a lot of threats from Barack Obama, very few of which have ever come to fruition. The fact of the matter is, John Kerry has lost a lot of status insofar as being an effective Secretary of State. The bottom line to it is, everyone here believes that American foreign policy is wandering. But getting back to your guest, he said Syria was prospering economically before this latest civil war. Well, everybody in the Middle East knew that Syria was an economic basket case. So his premise is ridiculous from the word go. Syria needed outside assistance to even survive. And what kind of resources does Syria have that the Americans want? I mean, I just don't know what he's talking about. What jewels, what crown jewels does Syria have that the Americans want? It's ridiculous, and I can bet you that Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, who's a friend of mine, would agree. There's nothing in Syria that the Americans really want.
Scott Rickard, do you have a reaction?
Well, it's quite simple. The Americans want to control that region. They can control that region by basically overthrowing the current government, putting in another puppet government like they've done in Libya, like they've done in Yemen, like they've done in Iraq.
The Americans have an ally in Turkey. The Americans have an ally in Israel.
Like they did with
the fact of the
Operation
matter
Condor in
is,
South
the two
America.
more prosperous nations in the region, Turkey and Israel, are American allies.
And I can't hear a word he's saying because all he's doing is yelling in my ear. This particular gentleman knows nothing about what the Americans have been doing over the past few years, and all he's ticked off about is the fact that John Kerry's not supporting Israel with a basically a straw sucking out of Israel's particular agendas. The fact is that John Kerry is a dope, just like Barack Obama. These guys are complete puppets, and they don't do the things that they're supposed to be doing for the American people. The fact is the American people don't even know what their government is up to, because the government has been controlled by foreign interests for well over a century. So this gentleman is unfortunately extremely misinformed, believes the rhetoric that he's basically been sucking off the news media for his entire life, and has some friends in the industry that basically have really misguided him for quite a long time.
Stewart Stogel, Scott Rickard didn't hear some of the comments.
The fact of the matter is, sir, the two more important countries in the region, both Turkey and Israel, provide what the Americans need. They don't need Syria. The two more powerful countries in the region are already allied with the United States. So the fact of the matter is, the Americans gain nothing by supposedly engineering a takeover of the Syrian government.
Scott Rickard.
That's ridiculous. Of course they gained something. They're trying to overthrow a government that they did not have control over. They're trying to overthrow a government that they've been trying to overthrow for over 40 years since the
Syrian
70s.
government?
So this is ridiculous.
Who elected the Syrian government?
This guy doesn't have the patience to listen to me and let me finish. Every time I start talking, this idiot continues to talk over me.
Well, we're going to unfortunately have to end it there. Thank you very much. We'll continue, I'm sure, the topic of Syria in our further debates, and we'll invite both of these guests back. Let me thank them. UN correspondent for Newsmax Magazine, Stewart Stogel from New York, and former American intelligence linguist Scott Rickard from Orlando spoke to us. And thank you for watching another edition of The Debate. From Mikava Tapwai and the entire team in the capital, Tehran, it's goodbye.